Hi everyone, Magnus here, back today covering the Armageddon game that was just played between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. There were two draws coming up before this game. They were pretty good, they were fighting draws, definitely some close games there, already back and forth. And let's just jump straight into the game and see what happened. So Magnus opened with pawn to d4, and we get knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3. Magnus not going for knight c3 and allowing the Nimzo Indian, which is often annoying. So he plays an anti-Nimzo with this more flexible knight f3, possibly indicating a Catalan opening with g3. d5 played by Nepo, going for this sort of Queen's Gambit decline setup, very solid by black, very good stuff. g3 played, Magnus says he would like Catalan, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, queen c2. Queen c2, not one of the most common lines in the Catalan, but I'm sure Magnus mixing it up, trying to keep Nepo on his toes, basically just checking out if Nepo is 100% confident in his theory. But of course, Nepo being a world championship challenger, definitely knows his stuff. Plays pawn to c5, exploding the center, meeting this little pawn cube in the middle, all the pawns looking at each other and basically asking who's taking who. Magnus says, I'm taking you, takes on c5. Bishop will possibly recapture, but also you can go for queen e5 and queen takes c5. Nepo does go for queen a5. We get knight to c3, developing the knight, intercepting the check, and putting some pressure on this center pawn. And Nepo decides to eliminate his pawn that was under threat and take Magnus's. So then Magnus castles, and now this pawn over here is up for grabs by the queen. Also could just develop with the knight, we'll see what happens. Nepo grabs it with the queen, claiming his pawn advantage, but it's not much of a pawn because this c-pawn is going to drop off, and if you ever try and defend it with b5, then there'll be all kinds of discoveries on this rook in the corner, which could be very dangerous. Bishop to e3 played by Magnus, kicking out this queen, asking it where it's going. Maybe it will go to h5. Queen does go to h5. Magnus jumps his knight into the center, offering a trade of pieces, and that would centralize Magnus's knight nicely, reinforcing some of the power against this queen side here. And all in all, it just looks like somewhat of a difficult position at the moment to hold. But after this fantastic move, bishop to d7 played by Nepo, it's clear that the bishop is coming to c6, neutralizing this beautiful light squared bishop from white, and white will no longer have this immense pressure on the queen side. Magnus decides maybe it's time to cash back in, grab back the pawn, but already this position is looking very equal after bishop c6 and knight to d7. But first comes this trade in the center. If you were to just play bishop c6, I'm not exactly sure what Nepo was not a fan of, but this position looks perfectly fine as well, although he does decide maybe it's a good idea to eliminate one of the knights from the board first, luring the queen over to here, from which it can then be attacked by the bishop. So Nepo attacks the queen with the bishop. The queen has to go somewhere. And Magnus plays this, what is considered an inaccuracy by the engine, and I'm not sure whether or not it was played on purpose or not, because Magnus did spend a decent amount of time doing it, and he didn't seem to have much of a reaction in the camera. But the reason why this is considered an accuracy is because the bishop can take on f3, guarding the queen, and if Magnus were to then take the black queen, then the bishop would cover it. And equally, if you were to take this way and recapture like that, then the white queen would hang. So the only reason this isn't losing for white is because after bishop takes f3 and you take the queen and the bishop takes back, Magnus does get this b7 pawn and the rook, although his bishop will be lost after the knight develops. So I'm not exactly sure whether or not Magnus thought maybe it was looking too dry and too solid of a position for black. He might have wanted to mix things up and just try and complicate the position, go for some pawn and rook for two minor pieces endgame, and that he did. We get bishop f3 and queen trade, and Magnus does grab the pawn on b7, snacking on the rook in the corner. Knight comes out to d7, getting out of the way so that the rooks now guard each other. We get a capture in the corner, captures, and Magnus plays this good move, pawn to f3, looking for e4 potentially in the future, but most of all, just blocking this light squared bishop out of the game, from which it can be completely dominated by these pawns. And he wants to try and infiltrate down the c-file, keep his pressure on this pawn, and if possible, he wants to try and trade off the dark squared bishop so that he can play this endgame without having the black with the 2 bishop advantage. So Nepo plays knight to b6, definitely makes a lot of sense. Now guards these squares and his rook can develop freely, also blocking this bishop's eye on the a7 pawn. Magnus brings his rook to the c-file, and Engine was suggesting a really strange move here. I don't remember exactly what. I think it wanted just to like put the knight in the middle, attacks the bishop and guards the c7 square. But Nepo instead plays this very nice move, I think, pawn to f6. He wants to reposition his bishop out to the e8 square, from which he has his bishop pair lasering down, covering all the squares in the board. Well, not quite, but quite a lot of squares on the chessboard, and he's going to cuddle up with king to f7, and he's going to have this really compact structure with all his pieces like this. He can centralize the knight and bring the rook into the game. So Magnus leaps on the opportunity, trying to trade off the dark squared bishop. Of course, Nepo declines with bishop to d8, saying, I'm going to put all my pieces in the back, and what are you going to do about it? I'm going to make the draw. Because, of course, if I haven't explained this already, Nepo does win with a draw due to this being Armageddon. Armageddon meaning that there is a fixed amount of time for each player's. There is no increment in the game, and also if one player gets low on time, they can just flag for the win. And also, black wins with a draw. White has to win, and white was starting with a little bit more time. As you can see, Magnus keeping his time edge just slightly over 30 seconds, but really that's not enough for it to matter when the position is at least equal and probably better for black. So Nepo decides to play bishop to e8, getting his bishops to the back rank from which they can control all these infiltration squares, and he might go king f7, regroup the knight, bring the rook into the game. Magnus plays b3, restricting the knight before delegating some more active jobs to his rooks. He does decide to bring the king into the game, looking for pawn to e4 in the future, king e3, f4, and he can get this nice pawn structure and try and get something going on the king side. If he can lock down the queen side in the future and try and get action on the king side, maybe he can cook something up. Nepo puts his knight into the middle, asking to be booted out by Magnus's e4 push, which he does. Knight goes to e7. Nepo now clearly huddling up with all his pieces like this in this kind of weird formation on the king side, although apparently it's pretty good. Magnus decides to infiltrate, and this slightly sloppy move, pawn to a5, as called out by the commentators. The reason being that Magnus can now get bishop to b6, forcing off this bishop trade, which he does swiftly. And now, with his rooks flying in on the dark squares, Magnus does have some domination over the dark squared complex. And actually, after rook to c5, the position doesn't look so bad for Magnus. Bishop d7, and I think Magnus starts to bring in the king, always activate the king in the endgame. Knight starts maneuvering around the board. Nepo seems to just be making some moves at this point, saying, I don't think you can beat me, Magnus. I've got all my pieces on safe squares. But Magnus starts lashing out with this pawn to f4. He's going to probably start pushing his h-pawn up the board at some point. Nepo playing pawn h6, solid stuff, putting his pawns on the dark squares with his bishop on the light square. And Magnus decides to start launching with pawn to g4, h4, g5 coming, and if he can try and chip away at this structure and isolate these two pawns, maybe he can get something going. King goes to e7, Nepo looks to be waiting, Magnus launching his pawns up the board, Nepo still waiting with his knight going to the back. We get an exchange here, and Magnus decides not to take with the rook, but actually plays the very accurate pawn takes on g5 after a bit of a think. Actually, not that long. It was only 11 seconds. But now his point is that he's going to try and play these moves. g6, e5, lock down this horse in the back. And he's going to try and get this pawn domination over these minor pieces. And if he can do that and then wrap around one of his rooks and try and win the g7 pawn, like something like getting the rook around the back, then maybe he can win the game. So Nepo tries to bring his knight up to the middle, Magnus activating the king, guarding the pawn, and possibly saying, I'm going to play these moves in the future. Nepo retreats, Magnus goes for g6, doesn't hesitate any longer. Nepo puts his knight in the back, and now pawn to e5, Magnus shutting down the position. Bishop goes back, attacking the pawn. Magnus is just in time to guard with his king. Rook comes flying into d7 just in time to get some counterplay on the back rank and attack Magnus's king. Magnus goes for the very, very patient rook to a8, point being that if you were to just take this pawn on a5, then you would get forked and you would lose the game. So now rook to a8 gets played. Magnus is ready to take the pawn, but not just yet. He delivers a check, forcing the bishop go to d7. If you were to block with the rook, then you would just trade the rooks and win the pawn and probably win the game. So Nepo very accurate again, blocking with the bishop. Rook goes to a7, stacking up over here, and it actually looks quite scary. Nepo goes rook d5, pressuring this pawn here, but Magnus just guards it. And at this point, it looks like Nepo might have just secured the draw, as he's just going to deliver checks to the white king and harass this pawn. And it looks like he might have a drawing mechanism with Magnus's counterplay stop short and the rook guarding. So the king's just shuffling back and forth. Nepo saying, Magnus, you can't do anything to me. Apparently, rook to a6, maybe to go for some kind of attack over here. I'm not exactly sure what the engine's idea is after just some checks. And king to e3, rook goes back to d5. Yes, the engine is saying that rook d6 is an idea, trying to go for this endgame exchange and then win the a pawn, and possibly white can play this for the win, although even this looks quite difficult. Nevertheless, Magnus starts repeating moves one time, looking for some way to improve the position, and he doesn't find the critical move rook to a6, going for rook d6. Instead, Nepo is now delivering checks to Magnus's king. Both sides are missing this knight to c6 resource to go for the pawn and just claim it. So both sides are actually just checking. Nepo's got that one thing on his mind, and it's the draw. But Magnus is just moving around. But at this point, he forces Nepo to find the move knight to c6, now going for this pawn. And at this point, the position is kind of falling apart. Nepo's just delivering checks, saving his king, getting out of the pin, looking to take this pawn. And I think at this point it's quite clear that it's mostly over. Nepo outposts his knight to the b5 square, b4 square, and the point is that he's just going to try and get a setup like this, where he covers up everything and he has no more worries. Rook goes to g5, simply stopping any ideas of ladder mate. Bishop comes out to d5, getting this nice outpost square guarded by the pawn and taking all these pawns. So the bishop comes out, starts capturing these pawns, and the point is that this pawn is not enough to win. Magnus moves his rook over here, possibly trying to look for some kind of weird ladder mate, but this simply hangs a fork, just like that. not just like that, just like this. And before Magnus can even get to it, so before Nepo can even get to the fork, Magnus resigns. He was quite low on time as well, so not even a flag to play for. Definitely a fairly good game by Nepo. Good hold, very combative chess most of the way before that as well. But yeah, it is good to see Magnus back and playing. And other than that, I hope you guys found this video interesting. And please consider liking and subscribing if you did. And I will see you next time. Bye.